If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, well, aging. In this episode, we are joined by Doctors Emily and Mitchell Kliansky, authors of Dementia Prevention, Using Your Head to Save Your Brain. According to the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, Intervention, and Care, dementia is not inevitable, and it is never too late to manage one's health. 12 medical conditions and health behaviors have been identified that can significantly reduce the risk of all-cause dementia. We discuss dementia and what we can do to reduce our chances of losing mental abilities and to age well. So welcome, doctors, to the Aging Well podcast. Let's begin by having you introduce yourselves and tell us how you became interested in dementia and, of course, why you wrote the book. And let's begin with Emily.
Thanks, Jeff. It's nice to be with you and Corbin today. Thanks for having us as guests. I'm Emily Kliansky, and I'm an internist and a psychiatrist. And I became interested in dementia because when I was first practicing as an internal medicine doctor through my residency, and then later on as a national public health doctor down in South Carolina, where everybody seemed to have diabetes, was overweight, had high blood pressure and bad cholesterol, and a very high mortality rate, particularly in African-American men there. I was running into lots of patients who had cognitive issues. And this was over 20 years ago, and I really was not educated about how to take care of these people. So I really did a deep dive into all the literature, the research literature that was available back then, and then realized at the end of my 4 years of servitude with the National Public Health Service that I thought I should go into psychiatry as well. So I went back, did another residency, and spent that entire residency really going into evidence-based literature and research about all the things that cause dementia, what we knew about how to treat it, prevent it, and I got deeply into the nutritional aspects of it, the exercise aspects of it, and how dementia, which affects your brain cells, is really impacted by all the other processes that are going on in your body, such as being overweight, lack of exercise, high blood pressure, bad cholesterol, heart disease. So all those things were really affecting my patients. So when I set up my own practice here in Springfield, Massachusetts, I did a evidence-based practice and targeted all the reversible, optimizable factors that impact somebody's brain. And lo and behold, it made a huge difference.
All right. Mitchell, how about you?
I said hard to follow, but I'm going to try. I'm Mitchell Kliansky. People call me Mitch. I have a PhD in clinical psychology and been a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist for the past, I'm practicing for 45 years, so it's been a long time. About 35 of those years, I've been board-certified in neuropsychology, which is basically measuring how people think. So we give tests to people that measure how they pay attention, how they're able to learn and remember things, how they're able to solve problems, tests of intelligence, tests of communication, and then compare their scores with what we would expect for someone like them, someone of their age and background educationally and occupationally. That gives us a blueprint for where that person's thinking abilities are and can diagnose dementias, progressive neurological diseases, and also the four runner of that, which is called mild cognitive impairment, state you have before it's bad enough to be called dementia. And there are people we see and we say, you know something, your thinking really is quite normal. Those memory lapses you're experiencing, those problems in remembering names, those word finding difficulties are probably due to anxiety or depression or something else. So this is really the way of I tell sort of like stepping on the scales and see how much you weigh. Doesn't quite tell you how your clothes fit. It may not tell you whether you're muscle or fat, but it does tell you how much you weigh. So we do that as a part of working with physicians and guiding them in terms of, and patients in terms of treating how they're thinking and helping them to improve or at least stabilize the kind of changes they're seeing in their brains.
So speaking of changes in the brain, describe to us in your own words, what is dementia?
Mitch, I'm going to let you do that one because you do that better than I do.
You just say that.
Yeah.
So dementia, I do it a lot actually, because I'm explaining this to a whole lot of people all the time. Dementia is a progressive decline that's caused in a change in brain function and structure. So when people develop dementia, there's changes in the surface of their brains, the cortex, and also changes oftentimes in the subcortical areas, the areas inside the brain that have to do with connectivity and thought processing abilities. When somebody starts out, they have normal cognition. When they begin to lose some of this, either as a result of aging or injury or illness, we see them lapsing into that state I call mild cognitive impairment, sort of a wake-up call. Something isn't working quite as well, but the person usually can still function pretty well. But we can start to see that on some of our tests. When those test scores get worse and when their function in everyday life becomes a problem, that's when we call it dementia, of which, as you're probably going to go into, there's a whole bunch of dementias, not just Alzheimer's disease.
Okay, so I'm 60 years old in pretty good shape, and I have no family history of dementia, no chronic medical conditions, no real history of head injury. Am I safe from dementia?
Not perfectly. You still have the average epidemiologically based risk in the United States of, at your age, 1 in 10 of developing dementia, because we can't necessarily predict who's going to get dementia, but there's the sporadic cases. In other words, the ones that are not specifically caused by a mutation that we could trace back in through a family. Most dementias are sporadic. They're not predictable, but we know it comes out to about 1 in 10 in men of your age.
Plus, there may be some other things which are going on that you didn't even know about. Because when I was 60, I was very much like you in that sense. And I could go down and say, I'm not really taking any medications. I'm exercising regularly. Everything, I'm working well, and I'm thinking well. But I didn't know at that point that I had obstructive sleep apnea, which means that I stopped breathing or my oxygen level dropped by more than 4%, 5 times or more every hour while I was asleep. So because of that, projecting that ahead, unless I had been diagnosed with that, treated for it, I would be at much greater risk for having dementia in my 70s. I also didn't know what my blood test looked like because nobody was looking at some of the factors that
Except me.
Except you.
me and some other very, very, very smarter doctors than I, because I read their research.
We really had to twist their arm to run a test for homocysteine, methylmalonic acid, some of the other, iron to total iron binding ratios, things like that are just not done when they're looking primarily at your cholesterol and your liver functions in standard kinds of tests for people our age. So there could be things lurking down there that you really don't know about because no one's asked the question.
I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
And one of the reasons why no one's asked the question is doctors, even today, as late as 2020, the most recent surveys done by the Alzheimer's Association tell us that doctors are still not being educated about how to identify all the risk factors that could go into helping somebody prevent becoming demented. And if we think about it, prevention is a heck of a lot cheaper than curing something. But unfortunately, prevention's not as sexy as curing something. Mitch has got a great example.
I tell people that, if there's a fire in an apartment building in a city, you've got like 8 to 10 fire trucks and at least 5 different news outlets, including some helicopters, lots of attention. But if somebody had moved the candle away from the drapes earlier that day, nobody would ever know. Nothing would get on the news. Nobody would ever show up. So we're really much more focused on waiting for bad things to happen and then responding, throwing massive amounts of money and personnel at the problem when we could have done a much better job upstream, heading it off. Would have been quiet, but man, it would have been a lot cheaper and a lot more successful.
So right now, the medical profession is not really being taught while they're in medical school or in nurse practitioner school or physician's assistant school, how to go about really preventing dementia, identifying all those factors that will increase someone's likelihood of becoming cognitively impaired as they go through the normal aging process, which we can really pretty much say is easily defined at 50 and progresses out from there based on neuropsychological testing. Bottom line is, if we could get people to listen and actually get motivated, we would reduce the rate of dementia in the United States by 1 in 2 people. Every 1 out of 2 cases could be prevented. That's huge.
That is huge.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because in the book, you provide a dementia prevention checklist. Can you give the listeners a bit of an introduction of what that is?
Sure. And in fact, I can even direct them to download a copy for themselves for free. If
Perfect.
They go to our website, which is called braindoc.com, and you click on the tab, you can get that dementia prevention checklist, download it as a PDF, fill it out on your own, and use it as a starting point for figuring out where you are on target with your health, where you're near target, and where unfortunately you may be off target. It'll also give you some things that you probably don't know what the proper answer is, because it does depend on some tests that your doctor probably hasn't run but could run, as well as maybe some things in your medical record that you don't know at the top of your head. So we've got the dementia prevention checklist, and the idea here is we're going to look at those blood values. We're going to look at your height, your weight, to calculate a body mass index, which I know is not perfect by any means, but it's, for most people, at least a starting point. And there's a number of issues why that isn't a great measure, and it may even have some racial disparities or some gender disparities, but it's at least a point to start looking. We look at blood pressure, because control of blood pressure has a lot to do with how the blood vessels in our brains are actually able to hold up as we age. We're going to ask them to get a hemoglobin A1C so they know what the level of their blood sugar is over the last 90 days. There's also questions relating to medical conditions like diabetes control, hypertension, as we talked about, sleep apnea. 50% of people ages 58 or more have sleep apnea, according to a study published just a couple months ago. And what's interesting about this study was this wasn't a clinical sample. These were 6,000 people drawn from major research centers like the Framingham Heart Study, the Mayo Clinic, places where people will go, volunteer. Normal people from the general population will go there, and they will allow themselves to be studied every several years over the course of their lives, so we can see how diseases develop. And this consortium was formed of these 6 or 7 different centers. And they decided that everyone in there, in this cohort of 6,000 people, would have a one-night overnight sleep study in their own house, in their own beds. So it's a painless procedure. It's really, really easy. And when the data came back, it was astounding that half of the people had diagnosable medical problem that the vast majority of them didn't know they had, that was improvable, and that would impact their energy, their sleep continuity, and their brains going forward.
As well as their metabolic processes that directly affect their weight, their blood pressure, their cholesterol, just to name a few other things.
You also see on the checklist that we talk about hearing loss. Turns out that hearing loss, subtle hearing loss, is causally related to dementia. It's that background noise, the birds chirping, the refrigerator motor going on and off, things that we don't even pay attention to, that actually send signals that our brain perceives and impacts the thickness of our brain surface, the auditory association cortex, as well as one of the background resting networks that we can pick up on functional MRI testing that's called the salience network. Salience basically being, gee, that's important. I got to pay attention to it. So people who don't hear well don't even realize it because it comes on subtly. Most people don't lose their hearing overnight. It's a gradual kind of process. And they tell, well, I can hear what I would need to hear, and I can hear conversations. And yeah, I'm turning the volume up, but they don't speak very clearly anymore. So they don't even know they have this. We ask people to pretty routinely get hearing tests if they're turning the TV up, their spouse is complaining, or they're just concerned and curious about this, because it's pretty easy to get these days. There's also things that people take over the counter that they don't know is affecting their thinking. How many people out there, and I know there's the answer to this, I just don't know off the top of my head, are taking over-the-counter sleep medications? All those things with the PM at the end of the name. And they're thinking this must be okay because it doesn't require a prescription. What they don't understand is that PM is short for diphenhydramine, otherwise known as Benadryl, and it is anticholinergic. It is lowering the levels of acetylcholine in their brain. Guess what? All of the major medications we have for treating dementia these days are aimed at preserving acetylcholine. So these are working in the opposite direction. And you add to that the medications they take to stop having to go to the bathroom to pee as often, those are anticholinergic. Most of the medications you take when you have a cough or a runny nose are anticholinergic. So there's this whole buildup. Some of the heart medicines, some of the depression medicines, all these build up. And pretty soon you have an anticholinergic burden. And we also have a link in our questionnaire to a scale that's been developed that'll tell you. You can actually put in the medications you're taking, and it'll tell you what your anticholinergic burden is. So that's some of the stuff that we're looking at.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. I did take the checklist. I like how you have in the book the little bit of you just scan the code. I forget what they call those little codes. I'm too old. The QR code, and takes you right to it. And you can actually do it online, and it gives you really, really good reading. And it fascinated me because it really underscores a lot of what I teach in my classes and what we talk about here on the Aging Well podcast. Is like, okay, you read this book and follow these things, you're going to age well. And it's going to have the same effect not only on the brain, but on the physical abilities of the body. And I found it interesting. I recall in the book, you when you talked about BMI, you kind of talked about a J curve, didn't you, in the book, where there's a bit of a J-shaped curve was that with BMI?
No, that was the alcohol.
That's
How
alcohol.
much alcohol
alcohol.
is okay.
Okay. Because I teach about Niemann's J in exercise physiology, and that relates to the immune function, that if you have a moderate amount of physical activity, you're going to have a suppressed, you have an improved immune function, and so a lower risk of upper respiratory tract infections. And during COVID, as I was doing a lot of research on the effects of exercise, activity, body composition on the risk of COVID, that same J curve was coming up, where moderate amount of BMI is actually, so in the low, say 23 to 25, where we're considered maybe a little bit over fat, which I would say hopefully is a little bit over muscled, or not over muscled. You can't really be over muscled, but having a little bit of muscle on the body puts you at a more optimal health level. And I would think it's kind of the same thing with BMI, that, if you're going to be really low in body composition, low in body weight, you're going to be either under muscled or severely under fat, and that's going to have an impact. And of course, you do talk in the book about the role of increasing obesity on the risk of dementia, as well as a plethora of other health conditions. So the checklist I thought was an awesome part of that book, and I appreciate you including that in the book.
Thank you. That's
Thank you.
great. Yeah, we're hoping everyone will just download it and maybe use that as a way of going back, then use and buy the book or borrow the book, because that's the next step is, okay, well, what do you do with that? And it's, it's not meant to scare you. It's meant to give you a roadmap going forward so that you can then learn about behavior change. So as a psychologist, we learn a lot about how to help people change behavior, which is, especially in middle age or older, really, really hard for a lot of people. It's
we get stuck in our ways and we don't want to learn new things.
Yeah.
It's very comfortable to be doing things the way we did them 20 and 30 years ago.
Plus, if we're men, we become perfect.
That's right.
Become? I thought we were perfect.
He did.
Yeah,
He became
perfect.
so
why would I
getting
change?
more perfect every day.
There you go.
So why would I change? And that's hard. And that's
Yeah.
the point is, okay, adaptation is really the key to survival, to success. And the challenges as we get older actually get harder, not easier, because we don't have as much reserve. We don't have as much resilience. And so it's harder to meet those changes. And we have to go about them maybe in a little different ways.
So are you saying, like, once you start noticing those changes, don't just ignore them? Don't just be like, it's nothing, I'm fine. And actually, okay, I'm starting to lose my hearing, right? I'm waking up with a lot of brain fog. Maybe I should look into this. It could be sleep apnea or something to that effect, right?
Yes.
Absolutely, Corbin, you're right. That's exactly what it could be. But again, a human capacity for denial is an amazing thing to watch. And if we're lucky enough to find that something is occurring to us and we become aware of it, it's so easy for us to just suppress that and push it down out of our consciousness so we don't have to bother with it. And what you're advocating is the exact right response, which is when you notice something, act on it, because your body's trying to tell you something and you better pay attention.
We also have to get doctors to value those complaints.
Right.
Because oftentimes they're used to dealing with very, very big problems and very sick people. And so when someone comes in and says, I feel like I'm not waking up feeling as fresh as I should, and I'm up a couple times to pee in the middle of the night, depending on where your doctor is in her or his career, they might say, oh, me too. That's no big deal. Come back when you're really sick.
Yeah.
Come back when you really have a problem. And so they're going to miss those. They're not going to say, well, that could be sleep apnea. Let me ask you a few more questions about it. Are you tired during the day? Are you falling asleep watching the baseball game? Are you falling asleep at times when you don't intend to? Are you more scattered in your thinking? Those are actually things associated with sleep apnea. I have about 10 questions I ask my patients. I never get asked those questions by my doctor. In fact, the fact that I'm on a CPAP machine, I don't even think is listed in my medical record. It isn't in several medical records I've recently seen of patients coming in, and I'm going through this list of symptoms of sleep apnea, and the person says, well, I use a CPAP machine. I said, what? They said, yeah, I've got sleep apnea. I said, I just read your medical record from the last 3 visits you had with your doctor. It's not listed there anywhere. And so it gets overlooked. It gets viewed as something that, I don't know. It's list all their medications and their allergies, but not their sleep behavior and not their exercise levels.
And when we're thinking about it, this whole fixation that we seem to have on obstructive sleep apnea, Mitch and me, is for a very good reason. Oxygen is really critical for processing everything in our body. we don't continue to make energy molecules, which, as you guys know, are called ATP, if we don't have enough oxygen. If we don't have enough oxygen, which 20% of our oxygen consumption is used by our brain, we basically are starving those cells in our brain from the actual raw material it needs to metabolize some of the most fundamental parts of our working bodies. So it's really, really critical. It's critical to maintenance of weight. If we think about it, people with obstructive sleep apnea have an imbalance of leptin and ghrelin. So no wonder why they find it very easy to put weight on and very hard to lose. When you don't have enough oxygen in your brain at night, you shift the relationship between leptin and ghrelin, and you shift toward a metabolic rate that is going to cause you to gain weight as opposed to losing it.
That kind of leads me a bit in. Oh, I'm sorry. You had more to say?
Oxygen is the secret sauce in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And it kind of leads me to my next question about your practices. In your practices, in the book, you talk about you take a personal approach to treating dementia. So you refer to this as advanced dementia treatment protocol. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, yes, it actually, thanks. That's a great question. It actually grew out of all the research that I did when I was in my last residency. I looked at all the then published reversible and optimizable factors that had been proven to cause dementia or affect the rate of cognitive decline in normal aging. When I went into practice, I actually set up a huge, great big database of everything that could be tracked about every one of my patients on every one of their visits. So it included the neuropsychological testing that Mitch does, but it also included all their vital signs, their heart rate, blood pressure, their weight, got their BMI, got their oxygen levels while they were at rest, sitting in my office, while they were walking up and down the hallway with a pulse oximeter on them. And then I ordered a nocturnal pulse oximetry on them, so I knew what their oxygen levels were overnight as a first step to determining screening for obstructive sleep apnea. Looked at all their medical records, got the labs for their cholesterol, C-reactive protein, CRP, ferritin, those things that we know that when we look in their blood, that there may be, indications of disease that are affecting the brain, the homocysteine levels, the methylmalonic acid levels, the thyroid, the B vitamins that are so critical. So we established that entire database. And when the patients needed something to be optimized, those individual factors were treated because those were correctable. The things that were not correctable, perhaps atrial fibrillation, or the fact that they had a hip replacement and had delirium after surgery. Well, I can't go back and change those, but we can sure change everything else. So we got them off the bad medications like benzodiazepines, sleeper meds, opiates, pain medications that are known to be cognitively impairing. And we also started them on dementia-sparing medications that have now been out for 20 years, such as Aricept, Exelon patches, Namenda, Memantine. And when we take a look at that kind of a customized, individualized approach for patients, combined with good medical care, what we found in a comparison group with Mitch's patients who were being treated in some cases by just their primary care doctors, the patients who received the advanced treatment protocol improved at the 6-month juncture. We actually had a separation that was statistically significant, where patients at all levels of cognitive impairment improved in their baseline level of cognition. And then to the end of the study, which lasted 2 years, they were at those same levels. So by doing what we're advocating, which we did in our practice, were the same steps we're advocating for dementia prevention, and has been found by research to actually prevent the onset of dementia, we actually can improve the cognition of patients who were already experiencing cognitive decline.
There's about a 15% improvement in their cognitive scores. I mean, we didn't turn back the hands of time
We
to
did
when they were
cure it.
40.
Right.
Right.
We did
We
cure
didn't, we
dementia.
didn't expect to do that. The fact that you're dealing with something which by its very nature is progressive. The fact that 2 years later, these people were better than they started, and everybody in the other group was about 20% worse than when they started, made for a huge difference in the 2 year mark. So it forms the basis for a lot of what we talk about, because we want to get people, even before they would be likely to come into our office, we want to get them when they're sitting there saying, well, now's the time to start. And the earlier they do it, the better it is.
So I kind of have an interesting question. So I know it was said that at some point, dementia really couldn't be determined or the causes of dementia really couldn't be determined um, until an autopsy was performed. And I know that's not necessarily the case anymore, because I actually used to work at an assisted living where we had a transitional building for individuals with dementia, Alzheimer's, sundowners, type 3 diabetes, like all of that. But I never understood a nurse would come in and they would just make that diagnosis right then and there. How do they determine the diagnosis and the causes of dementia in today's day and age?
I think there's several strategies. We make that diagnosis all the time.
Right.
And it's a clinical diagnosis. It's basically where the person's functioning deviates enough from their background level that really impairs their ability to think, to remember, to solve problems. And it translates into difficulties in caring for themselves. So you can make that diagnosis in the same way that you don't need to do anything biological really to say that somebody's depressed. You can make that diagnosis by how they respond and what their sleep patterns and appetite loss is like, things like that. I think what they were referring to was confirming the diagnosis of a very specific type of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, by then going back like Alzheimer's did in the early 1900s and performing an autopsy and looking at the levels of beta amyloid, a protein that forms plaques in the brain, and looking at the deterioration of nerve cells, what they call neurofibrillary degeneration, and see how there's this breakdown in the structure of the brain cells. These days, we can test for amyloid in living people in a couple ways. There's positron emission tomography, otherwise known as PET scans, where they can see in real time how much beta amyloid there is in the brain of a living person. And more recently, there are now blood assays. There's a couple large companies that you can get your blood tested to see if you have a buildup of beta amyloid. For what it's worth, we do not recommend people do this. And the reason being that it doesn't help you.
It doesn't make a difference.
Right. So suppose, number one, you can have high levels of amyloid in your brain and have perfectly normal cognition. And they found that actually in terms of autopsies, where they would autopsy people's brains and they would have normal cognition till the day they died, and they'd have a ton of beta amyloid plaques in their brain. That just didn't affect them. So you get a lot of false positives in terms of dementia if you just look at amyloid. The second is you're missing all the non-Alzheimer's types of dementia, which are really important and are oftentimes even more modifiable. So those are the vascular dementias caused by hypertension and diabetes and stroke and sleep apnea. Those are the dementias due to repetitive head injuries, the dementias that are part of Parkinson's disease in about 25 to 30%.
Dementias such as frontotemporal dementia.
Right.
Other dementias that are not so well known to the American public because they're not publicized by the American or by the Alzheimer's Association, which is very concerned with strictly Alzheimer's. So if you are interested in what the pathological diagnosis was, that's when you go and open up the brain after death. And you can look at it underneath the microscope and say, aha, we most likely have a combination of Alzheimer's disease plus vascular dementia which in the United States is ranking about 60 to 65% of what is found when you do a pathological diagnosis like that. But that does not account for the dementias, which at this point in the United States, about 20% of them have something called an I have to say it right, acrophilic grain disease, which, you ask somebody who's even a regular primary care doctor, what is that? They would probably look at you and say, I've got no clue. But the reality is pathologically, you can have a lot of things going wrong in those brain cells. But on the surface, which is what we're really trying to address clinically in an everyday life of a patient, you don't need that pathologic diagnosis to treat them optimally.
And one more point is, suppose you got that diagnosis, or so suppose you had a lot of beta amyloid in your brain. Does that mean you're going to work harder at preventing dementia? Oh, now I'm going to really exercise. Now I'm going to really keep my brain stimulated. Oh, I was putting off that hearing test until I got this diagnosis of a lot of amyloid. Now I'm really going to get my hearing tested. I'm just going to cut back on what I'm drinking. All of those things, you don't need to have that level of pathology to decide I want to prevent myself from getting worse as I age. So that's why we don't encourage people. It doesn't bias very much.
Right. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is there have been 2 new drugs released within the last short period of time by the FDA that specifically, with IV infusion, lower the beta amyloid in somebody's brain. Well, not surprising to doctors who are specialists in the field like us, but that strategy has not been demonstrated, even in these 2 most recent drugs, to improve somebody's cognition. You can get all the beta amyloid out of the brain, but that doesn't improve significantly the cognitive ability of the person. So, we've cured lots of mice of Alzheimer's disease by removing the beta amyloid plaque from the mouse brain. We have yet to cure Alzheimer's or vascular dementia by removing the beta amyloid.
Wow.
Fascinating. So you really talk a lot in the book about all-cause dementia, and that really being the focus of the approach. And in the book, you also explain that dementia prevention is not a passive process. Rather, it requires a more active approach. What can we and our listeners do actively to reduce our risk of all-cause dementia and to age well?
Take this from an individualized approach. Get the questionnaire, find out where your weak areas are. So rather than throwing a one-size-fits-all solution to this, and of course, there are some things. I mean, nobody argues with me when I say that exercise is good. I mean, that's just not something that I get a lot of pushback from. Instead, what happens then is they give me a lot of reasons why they don't. So I call it, I tell them.
And then what do you tell them?
I tell them, I want you to examine your butt. And they get wide-eyed and look at me. And I said, no, not the butt you're sitting on. The butt that's in the sentence, I would exercise but, because whatever comes after that is what you got to work on. I would exercise, but I don't like it. I would exercise, but I need a lot of equipment. I don't belong to a gym.
I don't have time.
I don't have time. Yeah. All those kinds of things are the objection to the sale, the objection to why it is they're not doing it. And we work with them on, let's change that. Let's find a way of sneaking into exercise by breaking it down into small enough pieces that you don't mind doing it, that it remains interesting enough that you're going to stick with it while you build up that habit and you start seeing some results. So I think that rather than trying to say, okay, it's not just, well, you have to eat this diet, or you have to have, X number of berries in your life, or as you probably see those commercials where somehow they're able to squeeze all the vegetables and the fruits you need to eat into 2 little pills that you can take. And man, I've got all my stuff right here in these 2 little pills. Stop it, please. It doesn't work that way. So you need to figure out where your strengths and where your weaknesses are and attack those through behavior change.
And we actually advocate people taking that dementia prevention checklist and taking it to their doctor and using it as a starting point for conversation. your doctor hasn't been bringing up those points, bring it up to your doctor.
So what about, is cognitive decline inevitable as we age?
That's a really good question.
So for most people, yes, in that while it's like many things, that we lose a half a step as we get older for most people, a few miles per hour off their fastball. All of us, not all of us, most of us in our 80s do not think as well as we did in our 50s.
Most of us at 70 don't think as well as we did when we were 50.
But some people do.
Well, we do.
That's right. But more than that, I'm breathing better now than I was when I was in my 50s. So that's partially why. But there are this concept called superagers. These are people who in their 80s think like they did in their 50s. And we've known some of these people. I wrote a piece for Psychology Today, asks the question, is Joe Biden a superager? And I happen to believe he is. And I looked at his health status and things like that. So I do think that it's become a political question as much as anything else, as we have the two major candidates most likely to face off this year, both older than presidents typically get to be. But there are people like that. I had a friend who I went up with him in his airplane when he was like 87 years old. He was flying at that point, they would only let him fly single engine planes. The FAA stopped him from flying dual engine planes and flying by instruments at, I think, age 80. But he was still perfectly competent at being able to fly and do all kinds of things in his late 80s. He lived to be 94. Eventually, some form of cancer got him. It wasn't his brain.
But physiologically, you're right, Corbin. Cognitive aging, for the most of us, and the wear and tear on the body of a mammal, every mammal in this earth, is pretty inevitable. It's just a question of how we respond to it, how we slow its process down. If you get really basic about it, the telomeres that are capping our genes, every time we reproduce a cell, we're losing some level of that telomere capping. By the time you lose all the telomere protection on the brain cells that you've got and on the body cells, well, you're not going to enable that cell to reproduce itself or replace itself any longer. So there's the wear and tear just simply because we're human beings. And we are driven by producing our metabolic energy by oxygen. And that process itself is damaging at a chemical level. We all know that. But it's really a question of how we respond through our lifetime to that. Education is protective. We do know that.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking with people with young kids, we say, keep those kids in school. We'll protect their brains while they're exercising and playing sports. If they're expecting, we tell them take their prenatal vitamins. So there's a lot of things you can start as a young parent that will make a difference in your child's risk 60, 70 years later without having to hope that somewhere along the line there is a cure that can be, a gene splicing technique or something that can be done at age 20 or 30 that'll offset the risk that you normally have.
For instance, that women, when they're pregnant, if they are gain more weight than is optimal, their child within the first 2 to 3 years of life will have reduced cognitive capacity at the age of 2 or 3. That study was done a long time ago. So I don't care whether you're a pregnant mom or whether you're a 70-year-old, we really do want to control the inflammatory processes that are directly related to lack of exercise and increased weight.
That's a really good segue to my next question, which was in the book, you discussed the genetics of dementia, and which I found extremely interesting because in my exercise physiology classes, my exercise science classes, I favor a quote by Dr. Per Olaf Astrand, where he says, if you want to be an elite athlete, choose your parents wisely. And so in teaching my pathophysiology and exercise class, I've become increasingly interested in the field of epigenetics. And so out of curiosity, is there any evidence of the impact our grandparents may have on our risk of dementia?
Well, when you take a look at, and let's exclude things like Huntington's disease, which is, an actual, for all intent and purposes, a death sentence by Huntington's.
Yeah.
If we look at all the factors that we have in that graph in the book, we can actually point to the fact that those modifiable factors to some extent are genetically conferred as well. So let me pick on this one. 25% of the people that have type 2 diabetes, if their grandparents had it and their parent had it, 25% of those people are going to land up with diabetes. That's a huge, huge risk factor. 12% of Americans with just Alzheimer's disease, let's forget the other kinds of dementias, but with Alzheimer's disease are known to have hyperhomocystinemia. Hyperhomocystinemia can actually be conferred by a single nucleotide change in one little nucleotide in your genetic structure. So there are some things that are very, very specific that do go back into grandparents and great-grandparents. There was an interesting study that was published over the last, about 10 years ago now, that came out of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and they looked at why the children, the great-grandchildren and grandchildren of the people who went through starvation conditions during World War II up and through the Nordic areas still have to this day a significantly reduced rate of heart attacks in the children who came from those families. And it's because the epigenetic, they've actually tracked it back, the epigenetic change that was induced by severe malnutrition to their great grandparents and grandparents still has a protective effect today. So we know we can change genes by the influences that occur to that gene after birth. And so it makes sense that we can look back at my, I can blame, by the way, my tendency to gain weight on my mother's side of the family, because I can look at that habitus. They were all short women. They all took size 36s. The men in the family were all skinny little short guys. But if you were a woman in my mother's family, all you had to do was look at my grandmother and we knew where it came from.
It's fascinating you mentioned that study because I talk about that in class. And that's kind of the study that really opened my eyes to epigenetics and this fact that, okay, not only do I have to pick my parents wisely, but I can pick my grandparents wisely so that, I can live a little bit better life because I've chosen those parents and grandparents better.
Or maybe the things that you're doing now are going to help your grandchildren.
I hope so.
Another motivation. It's funny. It's hard to get people to make changes for themselves. It's easier to get them to make changes for their children or their grandchildren. So maybe that's a good selling point for dementia prevention. The exercise you do today, the mental stimulation you do now, that may down the line genetically, especially if you're in your 30s or 20s and you're going to be able to pass that on genetically, that may make a difference in how your grandchildren turn out.
Yeah, and in those studies, I believe a lot of the genetic effect was when that feast or famine occurred, and it was generally right around puberty.
Yes,
and
exactly.
We tend to ignore the inactivity levels and the obesity levels in our young children now. And who knows what problems we are setting ourselves up for as a society, a generation, 2 generations from now.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you know that study. You're like one of the first people I've ever talked to who knows that study. And you're right. It is so salient and important, particularly for how we manage our children and our teens.
So I also, in a pathophysiology and exercise course, I suggest to my students that the best overall protection against disease is to not smoke, eat a healthy diet, maintain a healthy body composition, exercise, and maintain healthy sleep patterns. Does this advice stand for dementia?
Absolutely. Yes. It seems rather simplistic, but actually is true. It's again, they say the devil's in the details. How do you get people to do it becomes the problem. But you're certainly setting them off on the right course when you talk about that.
And from my perspective, I would add to that also, please try and avoid mind mood altering substances, particularly marijuana, as a child, as a preteen, and as a young adult, because the human brain does not really mature in terms of its frontal myelination until a man is between 28 and 30 years old, a woman 24 to 28. And that developing brain is actually really injured by the use of marijuana.
One other aspect of this, I think I would add to it as well, is the importance of social connectedness. And that's becoming increasingly important as we recognize that sort of COVID highlighted a lot of that. But the Surgeon General of the United States was talking about isolation and loneliness as being today's smoking, essentially, that it's that important that they make a warning about this. And the question is going to be, how do we creatively increase social connectedness at a time when people are less likely to do that? So tell them that, if they want to exercise, hey, get someone to go with you. Take walks with somebody else. Get involved in a team. Do things that also increase your sense of belonging, because that's going to make a difference.
It's kind of like everything we talk about and on our podcast. So that's interesting that you mentioned the mind alternating substances as far as like that age bracket. And you said marijuana, but I mean, alcohol is a mind altering thing as well. And I know you mentioned it earlier in this podcast, but in the book, you do talk about the J-shaped curve regarding alcohol consumption and dementia risk. Could you guys elaborate on this for our listeners?
Yeah, well, basically the J-shaped curve. So think about the letter J, and it's got a small little beginning section to it. It says that if you don't drink at all, that is somewhat helpful in terms of avoiding dementia. I'm sorry, the J goes down so that your risk actually is lower if you have one drink a day for women or up to 2 drinks a day for men. And in this particular studies, they found that those who drank 1 or 2 drinks were better off than those who didn't drink at all, but really a lot better off than those who drank 3 or more standard cocktails. So we're talking about an ounce or a shot, which is a little more than an ounce, of a hard distilled liquor like tequila or vodka, or 4 to 5 ounces of wine, or 12 to 16 ounces of standard American beers, the 4.5% beers, not the craft brews, which can be 10% or so. So there's sort of an equivalence chart here. There's some debate about this. There are studies of brain scans showing that even people who drink any alcohol, their brains don't look as good as the people who are teetotalers. Some of the early studies were sponsored by vested interests. There's a couple out of France that are the wine industry. So it's back and forth.
And they aren't randomized controlled trials. Let's be bottom line about this. When we take a look at the studies that have been published, they are not done with the same empirical rigor that we would test a drug's effectiveness, for instance. So they're epidemiologic studies, they're self-reports, they're diary-based. Anything that relies on a human mind to remember what it did yesterday or a week ago or last month or last year, God forbid, it's highly fallible. So when we look at the studies that are out there that support that J-shaped curve for alcohol use, I don't consider that reliable data, because we know that chemically alcohol is a toxin. We know it is a poison. We know that it kills heart cells. We know that it kills brain cells. We know that it affects the actual bilipid layer structure of cell membranes in our body and how fluid that layer is. We know that it affects how the various receptors that are critical for cellular transmission are damaged and become accustomed to the presence of alcohol or benzodiazepines. And the data over time in well-controlled studies shows us that cognitively, when you look at executive function, which is decision-making, judgment, abstract thinking, conceptualization, multitasking, speed of processing, various forms of attention, and working memory, when we look at that, we know that those functions in the brain are detrimentally affected by the use of alcohol at any level.
Having said that, we don't tell people not to stop drinking if they have fairly normal cognition and they're having one drink a day. If they're having 3 or more, we definitely tell them to cut down. We don't tell people to start drinking if they're not drinking. We don't believe that actually confers any added benefit if you add some alcohol to that.
Right.
So in real life, there are some modifications to the science in the same way that, people take risks in different ways and they play sports that have certain risks that can injure. So you have to sort of take a look at the science and also look at, behavior, I think.
Right. And this is a caution. If somebody is on a benzodiazepine, Ativan, Xanax, anything that is a sleep-inducing agent, or if they are drinking even like 2 glasses of wine a day, not the little 2 4-ounces, but the 2 8-ounces or the 2 16-ounces that you can frequently have poured down in restaurants. We urge caution and medical support in reducing that so that you don't increase the risk of seizures.
Wow. I also feel like with that information, though, that it brings up the question: should we push back the legal drinking age if the brain doesn't fully develop? But would you say 27 and 28 in men?
It's actually has been found to be as late as 30 in men. Right now we've got, depending on what state you're living in, drinking ages of 18 to 21. That is not stopping 8th graders from using alcohol. And we know that it's, the fact that marijuana is not legal at any age, under 18, depending on the state you're living in, for children. But apparently, by the time they hit the first year of high school, there's something like 15 to 20% of our young people have already become regular marijuana users. That's published data.
Wow.
So our age restrictions on alcohol use and marijuana use have not been effective up until now.
Yeah, and it seems like raising the age, all it does is make more people doing it illegally.
Right, exactly.
So it's really that education piece and teaching kids to have a little bit of wisdom and not just run around like the idiots that they are.
And unfortunately, we can't really expect them to be anything other than the idiots they are at that age, because that's a function of their brain development.
Right. So let's see. Well, we asked this of all our guests, and again, we'll start with Emily. What are you doing personally to age well?
Well, in addition to being happily married, because we do know that happy marriages do enable you to age more successfully and have better cognition. I exercise for 90 minutes a day on a stationary reclining bike. And that's both for make sure I've got a healthy heart, but it's also to help save my vision, because it's a way of improving the rate of growth factors that my eyes need to stave off the effects of glaucoma. I don't have high blood pressure. By exercising 90 minutes a day, I can pretty much eat a reasonable diet without gaining weight, and I'm staying in my size 6s. I do not take any cholesterol medicine. I've not had any I don't have a heart problem. I haven't had atrial fibrillation. So what I do is I exercise. Once a year, I look at my cholesterol levels just to make sure that they're okay. I check homocysteine, methylmalonic acid, which is fine. So I do everything that we advocate in the book.
Mm-hmm. I do similar, but A little different. One of the things that was really important to my health was discovering I had obstructive sleep apnea.
Oh, yeah. And I've got obstructive sleep apnea too. So we're both being treated for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, we got like dueling CPAPs. But I'm the son of a woman who had dementia, and my mom developed dementia in her early 70s. So I've unfortunately seen this from both sides of the examining table. And believe me, it's a lot better on the professional side than the personal side. But I also recognize that she and her siblings and her father, who I knew, all, and looking back on this, had sleep apnea. They would all finish their dinner, sit down after dinner, and remarkably all fall asleep within about 15 minutes and start snoring. So I just thought this was normal life. I didn't realize that this was something that was actually a signal for a medical condition. So that I credit with being one of the most influential things, because getting that additional oxygen to my brain has helped me now to actually be more creative and work harder and more efficiently now than I did 18 years ago when I was diagnosed. So I'm actually aging better in that sense. I also walk about 4 to 5 miles a day, do some body weight exercises just to try to I used to go to the gym before COVID. I haven't been back since, and I really need to look at that. But there was a time when it was just a little too scary to go there. I really didn't feel like working out with a mask on my face. But I've got a treadmill and I've got a rowing machine and I do some other things. I think a lot of it is maintaining the intellectual activity and the mental stimulation. I see 500, 600, 700 patients every year, and have a staff of people who work for me. And because of that, there's a lot of thinking that has to go into this. I really do believe that it's better to wear out than to rust out. Most of my peers are retired and have been for some years. And I don't see that in my future because, frankly, I don't know I could do anything that's more interesting than what I'm doing now.
Exactly. Same for me. I'll be 72 next month, and I can't even conceive of not having the highly demanding schedule that I've got professionally right now. I mean, it's what I do is fun, and every single new case I get is an intellectual challenge, and it forces me to learn. So the really important thing that both of us continue to do is we continue to learn new things and really force our brain to grow new connections. That's what learning is.
Okay, so as we wrap up, is there anything else that you two would like to add? Where can our listeners find you? Where can they find the book? Do you have a website that you're interested in sharing? Social media? Can our listeners find you if they are looking for more information?
Probably the easiest place to find us is on our website called BrainDoc, BrainDoc, braindoc.com. And it's got a link where you can buy the book through Amazon. It's also on, Barnes & Noble online. It's on audiobook at this point, so you can listen if you don't like reading. You can download it on a Kindle. You can download it on an iPad. There's many ways to get access. You can borrow it in a library. It's in somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 or 60 libraries, and they're connected library chains. So it's out there in a bunch of places. Johns Hopkins Press, which is the publisher, you can also order it directly from them. So that's probably the easiest way because it connects everything and it's sort of one-stop shopping, is go to braindoc.com.
Hey, well, thank you for joining us. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I wish we could go on, but we've had you on here for quite some time, and I know you probably want to get into your Saturday as the weather is kind of nice in the Northeast right now, so you might want to get outdoors a little bit more to, again, stimulate the brain and the body. But I certainly enjoyed the book and our talk, and I wish you all the best and keep aging well.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's been great to be with you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.